It is a very dangerous situation. This tornado is on the ground, a large tornado, moving right into the metro area. Get down, get in your shelter. This is a life and death situation. May 3rd, 1999. On that day, Doppler radar measured the impossible. Inside a vortex of unimaginable violence tearing across the Oklahoma landscape, wind speeds were clocked at 301 miles per hour. It was and remains the fastest wind speed ever recorded on Earth. The storm that produced it would carve a 38-mile path of absolute destruction, kill 36 people, and become the first tornado in history to inflict $1 billion in damage. It was a monster. But this monster, this beast that would redefine our understanding of nature's fury, did not simply appear out of clear blue sky. Its arrival was foretold in the language of atmospheric science, and its appetite had been whetted by years of unusual quiet. So, let's go back to where it all began. For 6 years, an eerie and unprecedented calm had settled over America's heartland. From 1993 through 1998, not a single F5 tornado, the most violent classification possible, had been recorded in the United States. For tornado researchers and residents of Tornado Alley alike, it was a statistical anomaly, a period of quiet so prolonged it began to feel normal. This tornado drought lulled an entire region into a state of fragile peace. The spring rituals of watching the skies and preparing the storm cellar had lost some of their urgency. The planet, however, was merely taking a breath. In the halls of the Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, scientists knew the peace could not last. They understood that the ingredients for catastrophic storms are not banished, merely held in abeyance. And in the final days of April 1999, they saw the pattern shifting. They saw the pieces falling into place for something terrible. The morning of Monday, May 3rd, dawned with a deceptive tranquility. The air was warm, thick, and humid. What Oklahomans call weather, it felt heavy with unspoken potential. But for most, it was just another Monday. Children went to school, parents went to work, and the day unfolded with the mundane rhythm of ordinary life. But miles above, a war was brewing in the atmosphere. A powerful upper-level storm system, a deep trough of low pressure, was digging into the Rocky Mountains. Ahead of it, a river of warm, moisture-laden air flowed north from the Gulf of Mexico, saturating the southern plains. Squeezing between these two air masses was the dry line, a sharp, invisible boundary separating the moist Gulf air from the hot, arid desert air to the west. For meteorologists, this was the textbook definition of a loaded gun. The atmosphere over Oklahoma was capped by a layer of warmer air, acting like a lid on a boiling pot, allowing immense energy, known as convective available potential energy, or CAPE, to build underneath. Values were soaring to extreme levels, over 5,000 joules per kilogram. All that was needed was a trigger to break that cap and unleash the stored fury. By late morning, the Storm Prediction Center had seen enough. At 11:15 a.m., they issued a stark outlook, placing a high risk of severe weather over central Oklahoma. The language was unambiguous, warning of the potential for long-track, violent tornadoes. It was the highest threat level they could issue, a crimson flag waved hours before the first storm cloud had even formed. How many people truly understood what that meant? At 3:49 p.m., the trigger was pulled. The advancing dry line began to shove the moist air upward, breaking the atmospheric cap. The pot boiled over. Along that line, the sky began to erupt. Towering, brilliant white cumulonimbus clouds exploded thousands of feet into the air in a matter of minutes, their tops anviling out against the stratosphere. They were supercells, the rotating behemoths of the thunderstorm world, and they were the factories that would build the monsters of May 3rd. The first tornado watch was issued for western and central Oklahoma. The machine of destruction was coming online. Initially, the outbreak was a series of skirmishes. A tornado touched down near Lawton at 4:15 p.m., causing some damage. Another formed near the town of Geronimo. These were the opening shots, dangerous in their own right, but they were merely the precursors to the main event. Meteorologists and storm chasers were tracking dozens of rotating storms, but their eyes were increasingly drawn to one particular supercell, labeled simply Storm. It had a classic, menacing structure on radar. It was a predator, stalking northeastward. At 4:51 p.m., near the town of Amber, Storm A produced its first child. It was a relatively weak tornado, but it was a sign of the storm's potent circulation. For 20 minutes, it churned across open country before dissipating. The supercell was just warming up. It cycled, reorganized its power, and prepared to unleash something far worse. The time was 6:23 p.m. Just south of the town of Bridge Creek. The base of Storm A lowered once more. A funnel cloud descended, tasted the earth, and in an instant, a new tornado was born. This was no mere precursor. From the moment of its birth, it was violent. Storm chasers filming its genesis watched in awe and terror as it rapidly organized, its condensation funnel tightening into a well-defined cone. One chaser's voice crackled on a recording, a mix of scientific fascination and pure dread. "We have a confirmed tornado on the ground. It looks like it's strengthening very quickly." He had no idea. In less than 10 minutes, the tornado underwent a terrifying transformation. It morphed from a distinct cone into a chaotic, churning mass of dirt and debris. Then it became something else entirely, a wedge. A solid wall of destruction, over a mile wide, moving across the landscape. The term wedge fails to capture the horror. It was not just a shape, it was a state of being. It meant the vortex was so large and so violent that it had consumed the sky itself, becoming a rolling, grinding cloud of death on the ground. On television, meteorologists watched their radar screens with growing alarm. The velocity display, which shows wind direction, lit up with a frightening signature. Bright reds and greens pressed tightly together. A tornado vortex signature of unprecedented intensity. David Payne at K4TV in Oklahoma City leaned into his microphone, his voice straining. "This is a large, violent tornado. It's just ripping everything in its path. You have to get below ground." The beast was now approaching the southern edge of Bridge Creek, an unincorporated community of about 1,600 people, many of whom lived in mobile homes. It was a collision of unstoppable force and tragically movable objects. At 6:54 p.m., a team of researchers from the University of Oklahoma, led by Dr. Joshua Werman, maneuvered their Doppler on wheels (DOW) radar truck into position. They were scanning the tornado at close range, peeling back its layers to see the monster within. As the vortex passed just a couple of miles from their location, their screen registered a number that seemed impossible. For a brief moment, an altitude of just 105 feet above the ground, the winds inside the funnel were measured at 301 miles per hour, plus or minus 20. It was a speed that belonged to the jet stream, not to the surface of the Earth. It was a speed that could not be engineered for, a force that no conventional structure could ever hope to withstand. The Dow team had just recorded the physical signature of total annihilation. And that annihilation was delivered to Bridge Creek. The tornado didn't just damage the town, it erased it. Entire subdivisions were scoured from the earth. Houses, mobile homes, cars, trees, all were pulverized into a maelstrom of shrapnel and then scattered for miles. The ground itself was stripped bare, leaving only the concrete slabs where homes once stood, swept clean as if by a giant, angry broom. Survivors would later describe a sound that defied the freight train cliché. They said it was a chorus of a million things screaming at once, a deafening, soul-shaking roar that was felt as much as it was heard. 12 people in Bridge Creek would not survive that sound. The monster was not finished. It crossed the Canadian River, undeterred, and set its sights on Moore, a densely populated suburb on the southern fringe of Oklahoma City. On the airwaves, the tone shifted from urgent to desperate. Veteran KWTV meteorologist Gary England, a trusted voice in Oklahoma for decades, abandoned all pretense of calm. "What you're looking at on the screen is the tornado," he said, his voice grave as a camera pointed at the black mass on the horizon. "It will kill you. You have to get out of the way or get below ground." The camera showed what words could not fully convey: a swirling abyss, periodically illuminated by the green flashes of exploding power transformers, devouring everything it touched. It was now 7:12 p.m. The tornado entered more near the corner of 149th Street and May Avenue. Here, it was still a mile-wide F5 wedge, moving at a terrifying 30 miles per hour. For the next 16 minutes, it would carve a path of unparalleled devastation through a modern American suburb. Inside a home near the Eastlake subdivision, a family huddled in a small interior bathroom. They heard the roar approaching, the house beginning to groan and shake. The air pressure dropped, so suddenly their ears popped painfully. Then came the explosion of breaking glass, the splintering of wood, and the feeling of being lifted. A mother threw her body over her two small children as the walls around them disintegrated. For a few seconds that felt like an eternity, they were inside the vortex itself, pelted by debris and suffocating dust, before being dropped back to the ground amidst the rubble of what was once their neighborhood. They survived. Their neighbors were not so lucky. The tornado was a lottery of death, and the tickets were drawn arbitrarily. A closet might hold, while the one next door was obliterated. A bathtub might offer just enough protection, or might be ripped from the floor and thrown a quarter mile. There was no logic, only chaos. Reporter Dan Anderson, filming for a local station, captured one of the event's most surreal and iconic moments. As the vortex tore through a neighborhood in front of him, a dazed man, his home just destroyed, stumbled into the frame. In the midst of Armageddon, his first disoriented question to the cameraman was, "Have you seen my pants?" It was a moment of absurd humanity in the face of cosmic violence, a testament to how the mind fractures when confronted with the incomprehensible. The tornado did not discriminate. It tore through homes, businesses, and schools. It ripped apart the Emerald Springs apartments. It flattened a shopping center. At the Westmore High School, it struck just hours after students had left for the day, a blessing of timing that undoubtedly saved dozens, if not hundreds, of lives. As the monster churned toward the most densely populated parts of southern Oklahoma City and more, the National Weather Service office in Norman took an unprecedented step. At 7:20 p.m., they issued a new, more terrifying type of warning, one they composed on the fly. It flashed across television screens in stark, capital letters: "Tornado emergency for southern Oklahoma City." A large, violent, and extremely dangerous tornado is on the ground and has already produced extreme damage. You could be killed if not underground or in a tornado shelter. It was the first tornado emergency ever issued. It was a frank admission that the normal warnings were no longer sufficient for the magnitude of the threat. It was a plea, a shout into the storm, begging people to understand that this was not a drill. This was an extinction-level event for anything caught in its path. The tornado roared across Interstate 35, a major artery connecting Oklahoma City to Dallas. It tossed semi-trucks like toys, mangling them into unrecognizable balls of metal. For a terrifying moment, it seemed to track directly along the highway, a nightmare scenario for anyone caught in the traffic gridlock. Miraculously, it veered back to the northeast, sparing the interstate from a direct, prolonged hit, but not before causing a pileup of wrecked vehicles and terrorized motorists who had abandoned their cars to lie in ditches. One man, an overpass dweller, sought shelter under the concrete bridge. He would not survive. The myth of the overpass as a safe shelter was violently and tragically debunked that day. As it moved through the rest of Moore and into the city limits of Oklahoma City, the tornado began to lose some of its incredible intensity. Its structure became more ragged, the vortex widening and weakening. It was still a powerful, destructive tornado, an F4 by this point, but the absolute peak of its fury had passed. It continued to damage homes and businesses in Del City and Midwest City, a final, angry swipe at the metro area. Then, at 7:48 p.m., after an hour and 25 minutes of life, the circulation finally broke down. The monster that had terrorized the state, rewritten the record books, and scarred the earth itself, simply dissipated. The funnel roped out, became translucent, and dissolved back into the clouds from which it came. And then there was silence. It was a silence more profound and horrifying than the roar that had preceded it. As the sun began to set, its light filtered through the debris-choked sky, casting an eerie, apocalyptic glow over the landscape. Where vibrant neighborhoods had stood just an hour before, there was now a vista of ruin that stretched to the horizon. There were no houses. There were no trees. There was only rubble, piles of splintered wood, twisted metal, and shattered lives. The smell hit first responders before they even saw the full scope of the damage. It was the smell of freshly splintered pine trees, of ruptured natural gas lines, and beneath it all, the sickeningly sweet smell of death. From the wreckage, a new sound began to rise, the lonely, piercing beep of thousands of smoke detectors, chirping from homes that no longer existed. The search began immediately. Firefighters, police officers, and ordinary citizens crawled over mountains of debris, calling out for survivors. They were guided by faint cries for help, or by the grim silence that answered their calls. The task was overwhelming, impossible. First responders were forced to make horrific battlefield decisions, marking homes where they knew people were deceased with a spray-painted X, so they could focus their efforts on finding the living. One firefighter later recounted the sheer scale of it. You couldn't process it all. You'd be digging for one person you heard, and you'd hear another cry from a different direction. You just had to pick one and pray someone else got to the other. In the coming hours and days, the true cost would be tallied. The final count was staggering. 36 people lost their lives as a direct result of the tornado. Over 580 were injured. More than 8,000 homes were damaged or completely destroyed. The path of destruction was 38 miles long and, at its widest, over a mile across. The financial cost was initially estimated at $1 billion, making it the most expensive tornado in history at the time. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The true story was written in the lives that were shattered. It was the story of a young mother who died shielding her baby, who was found alive in her arms. It was the story of families who lost everything they owned in the span of 30 seconds. It was the story of a community that looked upon itself and saw a war zone. The May 3rd, 1999, Bridge Creekmore tornado became a line in the sand. It was a catalyst for change. The live, on-the-ground coverage by local television stations, particularly the minute-by-minute tracking by meteorologists like Gary England and David Payne, was credited with saving hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. It set a new standard for broadcast meteorology during severe weather. The tornado emergency became a permanent part of the National Weather Service's warning arsenal, reserved for the direst of circumstances. The event also sparked a revolution in building codes and a massive increase in the construction of residential storm shelters and safe rooms across Oklahoma. The people had seen what an F5 could do, and they were determined to be ready for the next one. Because in Oklahoma, there's always a next one. The scar on the landscape eventually healed. Green grass grew back over the churned-up earth. New houses were built on the swept-clean slabs, neighborhoods rising from the ashes of their former selves. Memorials were erected, quiet places of reflection honoring the names of those who were lost. But the scar on the collective psyche of the community remains. For those who lived through it, the sound of a tornado siren, the sight of a darkening spring sky, the very feel of humid air, it all brings back the memory of the day the monster came to town. It is a legacy of trauma, but also one of resilience. The people of Moore, Bridge Creek, and Oklahoma City faced the worst that nature could throw at them, and they endured. They grieved, they rebuilt, and they remembered. The tornado was a physical event, a product of wind and pressure and moisture. But it became something more. It became a story of terror, of loss, of heroism, and of the unbreakable strength of a community that refused to be erased. The wind speeds can be measured and the damage can be calculated, but But the spirit of those who survived and rebuilt is a force that can never be quantified. The monster left its mark, but the people wrote the final chapter. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourself.